Thank you all for coming out on a Friday night for our Friday evening lecture series, and tonight's lecture, which is in tandem with our special exhibition, Myth and Marble, Ancient Roman Sculpture from the Torlonia Collection, which we are just so thrilled to be able to host here at the Kimball Art Museum. And if you haven't seen the exhibition, please be sure that you do and tell all of your friends that they must come and see it here. But it's my pleasure tonight, and also on behalf of our director, Eric Lee, to introduce our speaker. Charles Bryan Rose received his BA from Haverford College and his PhD in art history and archaeology from Columbia University in 1987. He's the James B. Pritchard Professor of Archaeology at the University of Pennsylvania in the Classical Studies Department and the Peter C. Ferry Curator in charge of the Mediterranean section of the Penn Museum, and was the museum's deputy director from 2008 to 2011. From 2007 to 2011, he served as the president of the Archaeological Institute of America, and since 2013 has been director of the Gordian excavations and as head of the post-Bronze Age excavations at Troy, both in Turkey. Between 2003 and 2007, Rose directed the Granicus River Valley Survey Project, which focused on recording and mapping the Greco-Persian tombs that dominate northwestern Turkey. He has been a trustee of the American Academy in Rome since 2001 and currently serves as chair of the executive committee of the Board of Trustees. He is also the recipient of several fellowships, including the American Academy in Rome, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, and the American Research Institute in Turkey. And now this was the coolest thing that I saw in his CV. In tandem with the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism, Rose applied to UNESCO for the archaeological site of Gordian, where he had worked, to be inscribed on the World Heritage Site list. UNESCO approved the inscription of the site in September of 2023, the 20th site in Turkey to be added to the list. So I think that deserves some applause. Rose's publications have focused on the archaeological sites of Troy and Gordian and on the political and artistic relationship between Rome and the provinces. In his lecture tonight, he will explore imperial women's dual roles as power brokers and fashion connoisseurs, not unlike contemporary women in politics. Would you please join me in welcoming C. Bryan Rose?
Thank you, Jennifer. Can everyone hear me okay? I want to thank everyone at the Kimball for having welcomed me with such hospitality. It's my first visit to the Kimball and, in fact, my first visit to Fort Worth. So it's been a wonderful experience thus far, even though I only arrived at 1:30 this afternoon. And it's wonderful to see such a large group here to learn about Roman empresses as represented in the Torlonia Collection. I won't only focus on the Torlonia Collection or only on Roman empresses. I will start briefly with the ancient Near East, then move briefly again into Egypt, then to the Aegean, then a longer period in Rome, and then we'll enter the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries as we look for parallels in the iconography of power for these portraits of ruling women between antiquity and the modern period. Many of the iconographic features of power, the iconographic components of powerful display, we see in front of us every day. So one could point to the radiant crown of the Statue of Liberty and the colossality of the Statue of Liberty, both of which would be used for portraits of imperial women 2,000 years earlier. or the use of divine costumes for rulers. In this case, George Washington, presented as Olympian Zeus or Olympian Jupiter in a portrait by Horatio Greenough in 1840, or temple architecture that's used for modern presidential sites of reverence. All of these features we're going to find used in imperial Rome, both for honors to the emperors and to the empresses and members of their family. Now, I said I was going to start with this iconography of power for women in the ancient Near East, and I'll move first to an object currently in our care in the Penn Museum, the headdress and cape of Queen Puabi, the Queen of Ur in southern Iraq or Mesopotamia around 2400 BCE. As you see, the cape and the headdress and the belt is a mixture of three different types of materials. Lapis lazuli from northeastern Afghanistan, the dark blue stone, the carnelian, the orange stone from the Indus Valley in Pakistan, and the gold, which was likely mined from the mountains in western Iran. So she's a walking advertisement for the trade networks to which Ur was connected. And this mixture of exotic materials will be a device that's used consistently for portraits of powerful women moving forward, not just in the ancient Near East and Egypt, but also in Greece and Rome. One other feature that we'll see consistently is replication of pose between ruler and god to signal a link between ruler and god. And so you can see that on the right with Queen Nefertari, the wife of Ramses II in the 13th century, who's being led by the goddess Isis, wearing the horns of a cow, framing the solar disk. And if you look at the configuration of the body of Isis, it's virtually the same as the body of Queen Nefertari. And you can see this for both men and women, where they'll put a god and a ruler next to each other and simply repeat the pose. As we move into the Greek period, the first real time when we get representations of powerful women is not in Greece. It's in Western Asia Minor, in the site of Bodrum, ancient Halicarnassus, where you would have found the mausoleum of Mausolus, the king of Halicarnassus, built by his wife Artemisia in the middle of the 4th century BCE. This was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And so you see a reconstruction of it on upper left, the quadriga, or the 4-horse chariot, in which both Mausolus and his wife Artemisia ride. That is extraordinary for a woman. Normally it's just the king who rides in the chariot, but at Halicarnassus you have king and queen riding together. And that's perhaps because it was here, as in Pharaonic Egypt, that you have consanguineous marriage. Brother would marry sister. And you can see 2 portrait statues, not necessarily of Mausolus and Artemisia, although they're usually identified that way, but members of their families, which are presented in colossal form. Again, we'll see this repeatedly, the image of the colossal woman, along with the image of the colossal male, generally the husband. Here we've got victory iconography associated with the queen, and this too is something that we'll find all the way up through the 20th century. We'll see the queen or the empress associated with fertility, with maternal qualities, but also with victory. Fertility and victory in an uneasy assimilation in many respects. In this case, we have another monument for Artemisia, which showed her branding the personification of the Greek island of Rhodes after Halicarnassus had been successful in subduing Rhodes. Normally, with such an event, you would have a victory monument showing the king defeating the enemy. But in this case, it's the queen who's shown doing it. And in fact, she was the mastermind of the actual event. But nothing like this had ever happened before, the queen branding the enemy, and it would never happen again. But it's an indication of how powerful Artemisia was. And as I said, she's the one who finishes the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, bringing the most famous artists of the time to do the final work on the sculpture. And this, of course, gives us our name mausoleum, because the man who was interred within the monument, mausolus, we would call it mausoleum after his proper name. As we move into, we're still in the Greek period, but we've now moved into the 3rd century BCE and to the court of the Ptolemies in Egypt, where they practiced consanguineous marriage, just as the monarchs of Halicarnassus had done, and as their pharaonic predecessors had done in Egypt. And to emphasize this close connection between brother and sister, king and queen, you have what we call Ugate portraiture, or portraiture one overlapping the other. And so you see here Ptolemy II and his wife Arsinoe, and then or Ptolemy II and his wife Arsinoe, and then their parents, Ptolemy I and Berenike, with the overlapping profiles indicating the consanguineous marriage. And with the Ptolemies, and especially with the women, they would use a cornucopia, a horn topped with fruits, to emphasize the fertility of the queen. And in this case, it's double fertility, because you've got 2 overlapping cornucopias, just as you have 2 overlapping portraits. And the queen will be identified by this crescent-shaped crown that she wears, which we call the stephane. That, too, is a device that will be used consistently as we move forward in time. Moving forward in time to the beginning of the empire, and let me just say a word about the development of Rome, because we're going to be in Rome for the next half hour, I would say. So Rome, you can divide into 4 parts. Rome of the kings from 753 to 509, starting with Romulus. Then the Roman Republic from 509 to the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, when Augustus defeats the combined forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Half of the audience is familiar with that from the 1963 movie starring Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor as Cleopatra. And this would then be Roddy McDowell. Augustus on the left defeating them, and then being in charge of the entire Mediterranean. That technically starts the empire, 31 BCE, and that would continue until the foundation of Constantinople in 330 CE. So for about 350 years, you have the empire progressing, and then the empire goes east to Constantinople and becomes the Byzantine Empire, the Second Rome. And that would last, of course, until 1453, when the Ottoman Turks sack the city of Constantinople and the Ottoman Empire per se begins. And then, of course, you have a Third Rome that's established by the ruler of Russia, who, after the fall of Constantinople, claims that Moscow is the Third Rome, and to drive that point home, he takes the name Tsar from Caesar, so that everyone knows that Moscow is the Third Rome, and he reportedly said, Moscow will never fall, so there will never be a Fourth Rome. And I'm not going to comment on that. But in any event, you now have a bare bones understanding of the progression of Roman history. We're right at the beginning of the Republic with Augustus and his wife Livia, whose portrait from Copenhagen you see, and this is the Prima Porta statue of Augustus now in the Vatican. When Augustus comes to the throne, there's a change in portraiture. Before Augustus, people looked old, even if they were young. So it was a mark of honor to have a portrait with as many sags, bags, and wrinkles as possible. So old age was good, even for the young, because if you looked idealized, if you didn't have a single line on your face, that could be interpreted to mean that you had been reclining in the Circus Maximus all day long, watching the chariot races and drinking wine and cavorting with the prostitutes. And therefore, you wouldn't have a lined face. I mean, that's a debatable point, but still. The fact that you did have a lined face meant that you had been toiling for the good of the Republic. So the more lines you had on your face, the more work, in theory, you had done to keep the Republic strong. So you wanted to look old. You wanted to look 50 even if you were 25. This is a type of portrait that we call veristic. And then comes Augustus, and this retrospective focus in portraiture will change completely to one of prospection, where everybody looks young, even if they're old. So you have an idealizing tendency, as you see with many of the portraits in the Torlonia exhibit. The lines are erased. Nobody balds anymore. Everyone has a full head of hair, even if they're bald. You wanted to look youthful, both men and women. And this is something that really starts with Augustus, after the death of his adopted father, Caesar. And so since everybody looks movie star beautiful, at the beginning of the Augustan period, youthful, idealized, good head of hair. That is a pervasive tendency in portraiture, whether imperial or private. And consequently, everybody ends up looking like Augustus, because everybody is idealized and youthful. And I'm giving you this overview because I'm showing you the stucco ceiling from the Villa Farnesina in Rome, late 1st century BCE. And you see this image here supporting a roof, which is enlarged here and enlarged even further here. This looks a lot like Augustus, and in fact, in earlier scholarship was always identified as Augustus. Augustus in a landscape that is what we call sacro-idyllic. But as Bert Smith once pointed out to me, emperors don't support roofs. They stand on top of them. The fact that this looks like Augustus is not surprising. Everybody looked like Augustus, whether they were Augustus or not, because every portrait conformed to this idealizing tendency. We have it we have had it in 20th century America. So here is the cover of Look magazine from 1963 with John Kennedy on the cover and his son, at the time, John. This is a week before his assassination. If you look in the same issue at people selling trains, you can see that everybody looks like a Kennedy. Even though they're not Kennedys, they're people selling trains. But it doesn't really matter. The type of John Kennedy was the same kind of phenomenally influential portrait type that quickly moved through the Mediterranean, and everyone ended up looking like Augustus, just as they ended up looking like John Kennedy. And it happened with the women too. Livia, Augustus's wife, would wear this elaborate curl at the top of her forehead, which we call a nodus. And that became just as dominant throughout the Mediterranean. Every woman copied the coiffure of Livia as first lady of the Roman Empire. And so you see this portrait at the right from the Metropolitan Museum, a woman with nodus. At one point, this was identified as Livia, but of course it's not Livia. It's just a woman who's been influenced by the portraiture of Livia, in the same way that you could have found many women influenced by the portraiture of Jacqueline Kennedy in the 1960s, who was fond of wearing pink suits and pillbox hats, and pretty soon every woman wore pink suits and pillbox hats. A few of you in the audience know what I'm talking about because you were watching television and reading magazines in the 1960s. It was the same sort of influential impetus that we see with Augustus and Livia. Now, Livia's statues were presented very much as a foil to those of Cleopatra, who was the evil woman who was trying to pull a good, solid Roman named Mark Antony from his appointed path in life. And so she, as you see here on one of her coins with Mark Antony. So there's a contemporary issue when Cleopatra and Mark Antony were ruling Egypt and the surrounding areas. As you can tell, he doesn't look like Richard Burton, and she doesn't look like Elizabeth Taylor, but she was heavily jeweled, as Livia would not have been, whom you see on the left praying. So Livia is shown as a pious, solid matron who is light years away from the Queen of Egypt, wearing a diadem here in her hair, and as you see with this elaborate jewelry that she's wearing. Livia would also wear the stola, this sleeveless robe that good, solid Roman matrons would wear. And so Augustus, or at the time Octavian, that was his original name, made a major point about this, pointing to the virtues of his wife and sister in contrast to the excesses of Cleopatra and the excesses of Mark Antony as well. When Augustus dies in 14, he is deified as his adopted father Julius Caesar had been in 42 BCE. Augustus dies in 14 CE, and in his will, he adopts Livia into the family, and she acquires the name Julia Augusta, and she is made a priest of the cult of the divine Augustus. And so you see that nicely reflected in this cameo. Livia here holding a bust of Augustus. It looks awfully odd, but you can see the agrarian symbolism here. She's holding stalks of wheat, which we'll see empresses holding for the next 250 years to emphasize their fertility. And you see this lion on a drum here, which links her to Cybele, or the Magna Mater, the great mother goddess of Asia Minor, who was associated with both victory and with fertility. Cybele, or the Magna Mater, as some of you know, was a cult that was brought to Rome at the conclusion of the Second Punic War, the war between Rome and Hannibal in 205 BCE. And shortly thereafter, the Romans win the war against Hannibal. So Cybele was always associated with fertility and with victory. And we'll find both concepts integrated into the iconography of imperial women after this point. Now, eventually, Livia dies. She lived to a ripe old age, but she dies in 29 CE when her son Tiberius is on the throne. And when she dies, they have to decide on the proper posthumous honors for Livia. And so the Senate votes a triumphal arch in her honor. Triumphal arches were something that had become standard in the posthumous honors of male members of the imperial family. So when Tiberius's brother dies, Drusus the Elder, who is also the father of Claudius, he gets a posthumous triumphal arch. When Germanicus dies in 19 CE, he gets a posthumous triumphal arch. When Titus dies in 81 CE, he gets a posthumous triumphal arch. That's the one that still survives. You can see that adjacent to the Forum. And so the Senate thought, okay, well, Livia has died. Let's give her a triumphal arch. And Tiberius says to the Senate, think again. We're not giving any women triumphal arches. So she doesn't get one. She gets plenty of posthumous honors, although she's not deified, but she doesn't get an arch. Later on, in reliefs of the late 1st century CE, we'll see deceased women associated with triumphal arches. This is the so-called Haterii relief in the Lateran collection of the Vatican Museum. And you can see in one corner the deceased woman who's placed within a triumphal arch, almost as if she had been voted one. But as far as we know, no woman received a triumphal arch at any point in the Roman Empire, even though there would be another time when a woman would be voted a triumphal arch. They would, however, be represented on the parade armor of victorious Roman soldiers. So we have medals now that are given to soldiers for meritorious service. You see that in this funerary relief of a Roman soldier. You see these glass medals, we call them phalarii, that have been strapped onto the parade armor, in the same way that military decorations are added to military uniforms today. But these were made of glass, and they were advertisements for the ruling family. So you would see the conquering general, in this case Germanicus, with his children scattered around him. This is a cast of what I'm showing you here. Here Tiberius or Germanicus, it's disputed, but here Agrippina the Elder. So women were being presented in military contexts as part of the parade armor of victorious soldiers. That would continue on. There would be changes in the iconography of women with the death of Tiberius and the accession of Caligula, who would reign for 4 years from 37 to 41 CE. This is the first time we get living women identified by name appearing on official Roman coinage. So you see Caligula or Gaius in this sestertius, this bronze coin on the left, and then his 3 sisters, all of whom clutch cornucopiae to emphasize their fertility. And you can see their names. Agrippina, this is Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero, Drusilla, the sister to whom he was closest, and Julia, whom he would eventually exile. Now, Drusilla will die in 38 CE, a year after Caligula comes to the throne, and Caligula will engineer her deification. So she becomes the first deified woman in the Roman world, 80 years after the first man was deified in the Roman world, that man having been Julius Caesar in 42 BCE. We wait another 80 years before you get the first woman deified, and when they do that, they need to figure out how to represent a deified woman. A woman who was not at the level of the gods, but no longer at the level of humans. She is superhuman, midway between human and divine. And what they do is to use 2 different iconographic features, the infula and the diadem. The infula is, which I've rendered in red here, or a rust-colored red, is a beaded woolen fillet, which had been used as an attribute of sanctity since the early Republic. So these beaded woolen fillets were alternating red and generally yellow or some sort of golden color, and you would use them to mark off the area of a temple or for sacrificial animals. As you see here, this bull is about to be sacrificed to the gods. The bull is wearing an infula. Goddesses wore infulas. Here is Juno with the infula. And they would also wear the crescent-shaped crown, a smaller version of which I showed you with Arsinoe II at the beginning of this talk. So the sacrificial animal wears the crown, goddesses wear the crown, and eventually these deified women are going to wear the crown, as you'll see a little later on. So they've taken the iconography that's associated with sanctity, even though some of it was used for sacrificial animals, and they've tied it onto the head of the first deified woman, who is going to be worshipped for all of 3 years until the assassination of Caligula. Now, we know a lot about the Julio-Claudian family, which is the family that I've been showing you, starting with Augustus and continuing until Nero. So starting in 31 BC, basically, and continuing until Nero's suicide in 68, about 100 years. We know a lot about this family because of excavations at the site of Aphrodisias in southwestern Turkey, where I had the good fortune of digging in the early 80s when I was a grad student. And we knew that there was a sanctuary of the Roman emperors here somewhere. We just weren't sure where in the site we would find it. I thought it would be next to the temple of Aphrodite, who was the chief goddess of the town. Now, originally, Aphrodisias had a sort of local Anatolian or Asia Minor fertility goddess whom they worshipped. But then in the 1st century BCE, the citizens of Aphrodisias said, let's recast her, let's market her differently as Roman Venus Genetrix. So not with this cigar-shaped cult statue, but the voluptuous Venus Genetrix, who was viewed as the matriarch of the Roman people and the mother of the Trojan hero Aeneas. As you know, the Romans traced their descent from the Trojans, believing that the Trojan hero Aeneas had escaped the burning city of Troy prior to its destruction and made his way to central Italy. So Venus, as a consequence, becomes matriarch of the Roman people, and this becomes one of the chief cities of the Roman Empire, since the primary goddess is the matriarch of Rome. So they built a Sebastion in honor of the early Roman emperors. The word for Augustus in Greek is Sebastos. So a Sebastion is just a building where the cult of the Roman emperors is in operation. This was an enormous complex. You see where we finally found it, not next to the Temple of Aphrodite, but next to our dig house. The only reason we found it, and you see it after a reconstruction here, and some of the nearly 100 life-size marble reliefs that we found, the only reason we found it is because the telephone at the dig house broke down in 1980. I mean, how do we know where to dig? Often we haven't a clue. We're just lucky. And this was luck, because the telephone broke. And so the telephone repair person had to come and dig a hole for a new telephone pole. And when he dug that hole, which was next to the bathrooms, the toilets, he started finding fragments of life-size marble reliefs of the early Roman emperors. So we started digging on a bigger scale next to the toilets, and there it was, which is where we hadn't looked for it. But as I say, altogether, we found nearly 100 of these, and they represented the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the gods on Olympus and the greatest heroes of Greece and Rome, all mixed together. There was a point, the more sculpture we found, the harder my life was, because the more sculpture I found, the more workmen he gave me. So at one point I had 40 workmen, and those of you who are archaeologists, which I realize is a handful of you, but those reliefs were just popping out of the trench at the speed of light. And every time, this doesn't make any sense, but archaeologists can be a strange group. Every time we would find a statue, the director would put on a record of Carmen Miranda singing The Lady in the Tutti Frutti Hat. It doesn't make any sense. Then that evening, we would have to pour a glass of wine into the ground to thank the gods for the discovery. As I say, you can't make this up. It's just strange behavior, but we did find 100 reliefs of the Julio-Claudian emperors set between the columns of the portico on each side on the second and third levels. So here you have a reconstruction of what the complex looked like. This is over 100 meters long. And originally there were about 200 reliefs that decorated this. It's under production for a long time, about 45 years, from 20 to 65. And so as they move forward, they're trying to keep track of current events. So we have a variety of emperors who are represented because it's such a long building period. The Emperor Claudius here, vanquishing the personification of Britain, which was his major military undertaking. This is in the early 40s CE. And as you see, she's been presented as an Amazon. Now, we would have known that this was Claudius vanquishing Britain anyway, because it has the portrait type of Claudius, and this is a standard way of representing, of personifying regions that have been conquered by the emperors. But in this case, we have inscriptions that go along with it. That was one of the things the Aphrodisians were very good at, writing down what they represented. So this one says Claudius and Britannia, and this one is of Nero and Britannicus, the sons of Claudius. Nero, the future emperor, he is 3 years older than his brother Britannicus, whom in just a few years he's going to murder. And you see he's holding the globe of the world, so land imagery, and what we call an aplustra, which is the stylized stern of a ship, so maritime imagery. This juxtaposition of land imagery and maritime imagery is very common in imperial iconography. And again, for the presentation of women, we have agrarian symbols. So here you have a wedding portrait of Claudius and his new wife, Agrippina the Younger, whom you saw a little earlier on the coin of Caligula, clutching the cornucopia. Here she's clutching sheaves of wheat, as Livia had been doing on that gem. Livia, mother of Tiberius, had been doing on that gem I showed you a few slides before. And they put the relief near Demeter, or in Latin, Ceres, the grain goddess, source of our word cereal, with Triptolemus, the founder of agriculture. So fecundity, fertility, agricultural abundance, these all belong to a corpus of iconographic traits that literally bury the empresses. They can't be shown as too fertile. That is the main way they are being shown, but there too, it's not the only way. You also have victory incorporated into many of the presentations. This is a later moment in time. Agrippina the Younger is now mother of the new emperor, that is Nero, who has taken off his helmet so that he can be crowned with a laurel crown by his mother Agrippina, who, and you see the cornucopias are getting longer and longer as they want to emphasize the extensive fertility associated with the empresses. So she's clutching the cornucopia. The drapery type that she has is that of Venus, Venus Genetrix, with this sort of triangular overfold of drapery and this diaphanous drapery above it. She's got a crescent-shaped crown, or Stephane, the same one that you saw Arsinoe of Egypt wearing at the beginning of the talk. And Nero is being presented as a general, a victorious general, because he's being crowned with a laurel crown, even though he hadn't done anything yet. He's 17 years old, and the woman, the person running the affairs of state, is really Agrippina, who knew what power was and knew how to use it. And that was what got her killed. Nero had her killed in 59, 5 years after he comes to the throne. First, by arranging for her bed to collapse on her while she slept. But she figured out that he was going to do it and wasn't in bed when it collapsed. Then he invited her to a dinner party on an island, sent a boat to pick her up, and arranged for the boat to collapse while it was in the middle of the water. But she was a strong swimmer. And so she survived and said, you know what happened with my boat? It collapsed. And so finally he declared her an enemy of the state and had her executed. She would later be rehabilitated in memory, but she's going to be gone as of 59. But here, she's riding high with both fertility and victory symbols in evidence. When you've got a dynasty and you want to honor it and you want to indicate that it would have no geographic, that the empire that the dynasty supervised or ruled would have no geographic limits and no temporal limits, the easiest way to do that, we're still in the Aphrodisias Sebastion, is to personify aspects of time and space. So here you see two of those reliefs, or two of those personifications. The day here, we wouldn't necessarily have known this was the day if we didn't have the inscription that we found with it saying, "This is the day." And the day is always female. On the right side, the ocean. And again, we have an inscription saying, "This is the ocean." So we've got physical features and temporal features. Probably we also have here the dawn, the seasons, the evening star. And if we have the oceans, we have the mountains and the rivers as well, to try to indicate that this dynasty would last forever and would encompass the entire world, at least the known world. And in the course of honoring the dynasty, they would begin using stars to signify divinity or to signify heroism. So this is an example on upper left, the so-called Ravenna relief. Here is Germanicus. He's had one star carved on his forehead, and they apparently thought that wasn't enough, so they inserted yet another star, which surely was gilded bronze, directly above it. Sometimes they would use radiate crowns, so a different type of solar imagery, as you see here with the divine Augustus. And of course, this is the crown that the Statue of Liberty wears. The stars and the radiate crowns were not used very often for women. If anything, they were used more often for deceased children, as you see on this coin from the late 1st century CE, where a child who dies as an infant is surrounded by stars. The only empress I can think of who gets the star is Plotina, the wife of the Emperor Trajan, during whose reign the empire reaches its greatest extent, extending from Britain all the way to the Persian Gulf. It would never get bigger than this. We're in the early 2nd century CE. Trajan would be deified, as would his wife Plotina, whom you see here. And after they're deified, during the reign of Trajan's successor Hadrian, who occupies the obverse of the coin, they get stars. Not only do they get stars, but they are buried in the base of the column of Trajan, which is, in a way, the centerpiece of Trajan's Forum in Rome, the largest of the 5 imperial fora in Rome. So you can see it here. Much of this is still visible, with a basilica leading to the column of Trajan, which of course still stands. And originally, the details would have been picked out in paint, which would have been true as well for the next historical column in Rome, the column of Marcus Aurelius. Although all of the paint has now disintegrated from the column. Nevertheless, we have plenty of ancient reliefs and sculpture that shows us all of them were elaborately painted. And so it's in the base here, which is hollow, that the ashes of Trajan and Plotina are placed. Now, we're within the city line here. We're within the so-called pomerium, the city line of Rome. This was a phenomenal honor to be buried within the city. No woman has ever done that before or had that done for them. The Emperor Domitian in the late 1st century CE does do it. He buries puts the ashes of his family in a temple within the pomerium, but then he is executed, assassinated, he's damned by the Senate, and all those ashes go away. So at the time when Plotina's body and Trajan's body are placed in the base of the column of Trajan, they're the only monarchs to have been buried within the confines of the city. And it would never happen again. So it's an extraordinary honor for Plotina. Now, as we move into the reigns of Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius, we're moving into nearly a century of 5 good emperors. 5 good ones, one after the other. That had never happened before, because you've got some good ones, and then you've got some mediocre ones, and then you've got Caligula and Nero. This is a new period in time. If you have to go back to a time in Rome and you want to go back to a prosperous time, then this is the time you want to do it, the period of the 5 good emperors. After Trajan, we have Hadrian, who is adopted at the very end of Trajan's life as the next emperor. There was no biological connection between them, and he would reign from 117 to 138. And we now have portraits of women that enter Roman state monuments for the first time. So here you see, this was my title slide, Hadrian's wife, Sabina, who is going up to the heavens on a figure whom we would probably call eternity or aeternitas. She's holding a torch. Much of this is restored in the 17th century, but the torch seems legitimate. Sabina is intact. Most of aeternitas is intact. Here is Hadrian pointing up to Sabina and the Campus Martius, the region in the north of Rome where the pyre would have been placed, where the body would have been placed on the pyre and burned to ashes, and then the ashes interred in the mausoleum, the imperial mausoleum. So this is our first monumental representation of a woman ascending into the heavens and ascending on eternity. Eternity in Greece is personified as a male. Eternity in Rome is personified as a female. Why you have this gender juxtaposition, I'm not sure. But it may have been part of a portal. I don't want to say arch. These are reused in late antiquity, and so we don't know the original context, but it had a companion relief, Hadrian speaking to the people with the personification of the Roman people here, probably speaking about the welfare program that he established and perhaps saying something about the life of Sabina. Anyway, we're getting women, deified women now entering a broader public stage, and she would be deified at the end of her life. Hadrian would also deify his mother-in-law, Matidia, and she's the first woman to get her own temple. In fact, she's the only woman to get her own temple in the city of Rome. Faustina the Elder would get a temple for 20 years to herself, but then she has to share it with her husband thereafter. So the only woman who gets her own temple and keeps it for the rest of time is Matidia. You see her here. There's a portrait in the Torlonia Collection that was once identified as Matidia and is now doubted. But you see Matidia in actuality here, and then in the guise of pietas, or piety, on the reverse with her two children, Sabina, the wife of Hadrian, and Matidia Minor. So Sabina's sister, also named Matidia. And the temple is set up here just to the northeast of the Pantheon, a phenomenally prominent location near the Antonine or 2nd century CE imperial pyres, and next to the area where a temple of the divine Hadrian would be built. Now, Matidia Minor, she shows up in a theater in a site called Sesse Aurunca. You see Rome here, Naples down here, so it's closer to Naples than Rome, but between the two of them. And this is an extraordinary statue of Matidia, who died in 119. You can see that the marble is of two types, a dark blue marble and a white marble, both of which are probably quarried in the region around Aphrodisias, which had executed or built the Sebastian that I showed you a little earlier. So the use of exotic materials for the representation of Matidia is noteworthy in and of itself. Think back to the juxtaposition of different types of exotic materials for Puabi, Queen of War, at the beginning of the lecture, and she's presented in a kind of victory pose. So again, with this wind, it looks as if wind is blowing the diaphanous drapery against her body. So again, the incorporation of triumphal iconography along with exotic presentation. Some of these portraits were colossal, and as I say, all of them were painted. What I'm showing you here is just one of many colossal portraits of empresses from the 2nd century. This one excavated at Sardis in west central Turkey, a Harvard Cornell excavation. She died in 140, and I'm showing you the colorized version of Faustina the Elder. These are increasingly common now. You can find them all over the internet. And how do we know what color these were? It's not easy, because in the 18th and 19th centuries, even the early 20th century, they were fond of snowy white sculpture. So if paint survived on the sculpture, they would take it off so that it was snowy white, which is a kind of Renaissance conceit. But you can use a technique now called X-ray fluorescence. You take a kind of laser gun, so not unlike this, and you go across the surface of the sculpture, and that will measure or record the kinds of pigments, the ingredients of the pigments that were once there, even if they're no longer visible to the naked eye. Especially in the folds of draperies, you find elements of the pigment still in place, at least enough for the X-ray fluorescence, because even the most ardent restorer of the 19th century would not have gone in with his chisel to the deepest of the drapery folds to scrape off that paint. Now, as I said, Faustina the Elder also gets her own temple, but it's only for 20 years. This is built in the middle of the Roman Forum, next to, across from, the sanctuary of Vesta, the so-called Atrium Vestae. Vesta is the goddess of the hearth and the home and maternal qualities. She is chaste herself, celibate herself, but nevertheless a goddess of the home and of the household and of wives. So this is no accident, placing Faustina the Elder across from the personification of female virtue. As you see on the temple, which survives because it was turned into a church in the Baroque period, you have the inscription Tu Diva Faustina. Now, normally that inscription would be placed up here in the frieze. They place it below that in the architrave because I think they knew that eventually Faustina's husband would die. He's one of the 5 good emperors, so he's going to be deified. He's not going to be damned. And his cult can be put in this temple. And if they do that, then they can just write to the divine Antoninus and. You see the et here. And then they save the expense of doing a whole new inscription. And the inscription of Faustina can survive intact as it was. And with this temple too, even though it's faded over time, this had fancy Cipollino columns, this green veined column type from the Greek island of Euboea, just to the east of Greece. It's another use of exotic materials to extol the achievements, the reputation, to honor the woman whose cult is practiced in this temple. Now, when you utilize the pyres, these 2nd century pyres, the body would go in and you would set it on fire. And we have these pyres represented on coins. This is where they were, just north of the Temple of Matidia and the Pantheon and the Temple of the deified Hadrian. So based on the coins, these are the reconstructions that have been made. And as you see at the top of the pyre, there would be a cage. In the cage would be an eagle. You would set the pyre on fire, and the eagle had a choice. The eagle could stay in place and burn to a crisp or fly up into the heavens. And the eagles always flew up into the heavens because it was on fire. Their cage was on fire. And so that was viewed as symbolizing the ascent of the souls or the spirits of emperor and empress into the heavens. And we see that represented on the column base of Antoninus Pius, where both Antoninus and his wife Faustina are honored. This is now in the Vatican, set up after the death of Antoninus Pius in 161. So you see to the divine Antoninus Pius here. There are infantry and equestrian parades on 2 sides. It's represented on coins as well. And on the front of it, or what we generally interpret as the front, you have Antoninus and Faustina going up into the heavens together. It's the only imperial couple that goes up into eternity as a couple, even though they died at different times, 20 years apart. So here is Antoninus Pius, here is Faustina. Both of them have scepters, and they're going up into the heavens on the back of a winged figure who is not eternity, because eternity is female in Rome. We don't actually know what name to give this figure, although he connotes eternity. He's the vehicle of apotheosis. We're in the Vatican. That's why there's a fig leaf here. And then you have a place locator for the pyre. It's being used in the Campus Martius, and so you show the personification of the Campus Martius here, a youthful man holding an obelisk. This is one of the obelisks that Augustus brings back from Egypt right after he's victorious over Cleopatra in the late 1st century BCE. and uses it as a symbol of Roman conquest over Egypt. And it becomes a standard symbol of the Campus Martius. And waving goodbye to the couple is the personification of Rome, presented as an Amazon, or Amazonian iconography, one breast covered, one breast free, and then a shield with the wolf and Romulus and Remus underneath, and then the ground scattered with weapons of the enemy. We won't get this again, although we will continue to get images of the apotheosis of women flying up to the heavens on winged creatures. Here is another portrait from the Torlonia Collection, Faustina the Younger, who died in 175. She is deified. She was famous for being the embodiment of fecundity writ large. She had 14 children, not all of whom survived into adulthood. I think only 6 survived into adulthood, but the woman was tired. You see her here with fecundity, the personification of fecundity, surrounded by children, and then Faustina going up into the heavens on a peacock, which is a standard mode of apotheosis for imperial women, and that the peacock was the sacred bird of Juno, wife of Jupiter. Now, there are 5 good emperors, and then it stops. Then you get Commodus, played by Joaquin Phoenix in the movie Gladiator, as some of you will have seen. And then you enter a new dynasty, the Severan dynasty, which will last for a little over 40 years, from 193 to 211 under Septimius Severus. Then his son Caracalla, whose baths you know. Then Elagabalus, who had a lot in common with Caligula, and then Alexander Severus, dead in 235. That would bring down the dynasty. So the first third of the 3rd century, and the powerful woman at the beginning of that dynasty was Julia Domna, wife of Septimius Severus, who is now emperor. Septimius is the first African emperor. He is from Tripolitania, modern-day Libya. Julia was Syrian. So she was the daughter of the priest of the Syrian sun god, often associated with the Mesopotamian sun god Shamash, and their children were Caracalla and Geta. Now, this was a feuding family, but if you have a feuding family, you put out images saying, "We've never been happier." And that's what they did. Here's Julia Domna in a rare frontal pose. You generally don't use frontal portraits on coins because you can't stack them. And then Caracalla and Geta on either side with Felicitas Saeculi, the happiness of the times. We get it's not an arch, it's post and lintel, but it's like an arch, called the Arch of the Argentarii, the Arch of the Silversmiths, although Arch of the Cattle Merchants would be a better title. A bomb has damaged part of it, so this is an old photo, but you see it's completely covered with sculpture. You have Septimius and Julia here, and originally they were next to little Geta, who was assassinated by his brother Caligula and then wiped away as if he had never been there. You have the same thing on the opposite side with Caracalla, his wife Plautilla, and his father-in-law, Plautianus. Caracalla, in time, came to hate both his father-in-law and his wife, and had them branded enemies of the state, executed, and damned. So this is what it looked like originally, and this is what it looks like now. You see Plautilla, or you don't see her. Sometimes women of power could be powerless if the presiding politics turned against them. And so there are plenty of examples wherein literally the lady vanishes, to paraphrase Alfred Hitchcock. Now, Julia, you see here, is holding up her right arm with palm facing forward, which is exactly what the Syrian sun god would do, Shamash. This is from Palmyra, so much of which has been destroyed in recent years by ISIS. But it's the same gesture that Shamash is making that Julia Domna makes. Again, just as we saw with Nefertari and Isis, repetition of pose between ruler and the divine to indicate a link between the two of them. When Caracalla becomes emperor, he doesn't kill his mother. There's a relief made of her crowning her son at his accession. And here you see Julia Domna. She's got a Venus portrait, a Venus statuary type, again with this triangular overfold, but she's holding a palm branch, and she's crowning Caracalla with a laurel crown, just as you had seen with Agrippina the Younger and Nero in the Aphrodisia Sebastion, and two barbarians, one from the west, one from the east, tied to a trophy at the side. Some of these women in the Severan dynasty are just overloaded with victory and fertility imagery, so much so that you think the coin is going to sink. So here's the mother of Alexander Severus, 222 to 235, Julia Mamaea. She's got a cornucopia. Behind that, you see the wings of victory. She's got a crown of stalks of wheat. She's holding a torch, and surrounding the torch are stalks of wheat. So fertility, fertility, victory. And then on the reverse, she's sitting and she's being given an apple by Venus. This is the apple that Venus got in the Judgment of Paris competition that starts the Trojan War. The golden apple from the Hesperides. And Venus is essentially saying to Julia Mamaea, you take it now, you're even greater than I am. Of course, in a few short years, Julia Mamaea would be executed and her body dragged through the streets of the city, but at the moment, she's riding high. Now, in the 4th century, we get a complete change in the religious systems of the empire as the religions about which I've been speaking go out of use, and Christianity becomes the dominant religion of the Mediterranean. The triumphal arch has now been moved inside the building. So this is a triumphal arch placed over the altar. And so, whereas before the arch was exterior and celebrated military victory, it's now going to be placed on the interior and celebrate spiritual victory. And rather than mothers crowning sons, we get sons crowning mothers, as you see here with Christ crowning the Virgin Mary, which is a motif or a type that you see in many of the early Christian churches. And many of these features that I've shown you involving the empresses are still used in later periods. Let's take this as an example, Rubens' painting of the apotheosis of Henry IV, where you have Marie de Medici, who, as you see, has been placed within a triumphal arch, like the woman on the relief of the Heterii that I showed you earlier, right here. And you also have her being given a rudder and the globe of the world, just like you saw on the portrait from Aphrodisias of Nero holding the aplustra, which is analogous to the rudder, and his own globe here. I had just given you a summary of the Trophy of Warsaw. And in the Trophy of Warsaw, you've got, as you now know, fertility iconography and victory iconography. And you have the same sort of thing in monuments of the 19th and 20th centuries, honoring women of power. One of my favorites is Anita Garibaldi just off the on the slope of the Janiculum Hill near the American Academy in Rome. And you can see that she's on horseback. In one arm, she has a pistol. In the other, she has a baby. So she's being honored as a warrior and as a mother, which is not so different from what we've seen being used for the empresses. Or we could turn to the Queen Victoria Memorial in London in 1911. Queen Victoria here as part of a monument topped by victory with the personification of motherhood used as a counterpart to Queen Victoria herself. I've emphasized ad infinitum the use of agrarian symbols to highlight the fertility of the Roman empresses. Do we have an emphasis on similar ideas or concepts of fertility in portraits of women of power in later periods? We do, generally with flowers or with bouquets. So you're seeing Marie Antoinette with a flower here, and then Edith Wilson and Patricia Nixon with flowers here. Usually in portraits of first ladies, either they get a single flower or they get bunches of flowers, but the flowers are always placed next to the lap as a way, again, of emphasizing their maternal qualities. Do we still get colossal portraits of women? As you saw with a few of the examples, including Faustina the Elder that I showed you a little earlier, you do, but in a very different form with very different materials. This is Buenos Aires, and this is a colossal steel portrait of Evita Peron, whom you know of from the Broadway musical Evita. You can find colossal portraits of Indira Gandhi in India, although by and large, it's not used with the same frequency that you would have found in the Roman Empire. So when we speak of portraits of women of power, whether ancient or modern, as you can see, there are more similarities than there are differences, especially with regard to the iconography of power. They're all drawing from the same iconographic repertoire, even though they're all separated by centuries. And in drawing from that iconographic repertoire, we can truly say that they are images that continue to look divine. Thank you for listening to me tonight. Thank you for being members of the Kimball.